So for our final part of the day, I'm very pleased to introduce Kevin Welsh, who's Chief Sustainability Officer for Airlines for America, and will lead a panel that is going to cover a whole range of different topics to do with decarbonisation. We've heard about the various different levers to get to reducing CO2 emissions, but around that there are other questions as well. And so Kevin's going to lead us through those questions.
All right, thank you very much, Haldane. Great to be the last panel up here, and looking forward to a great discussion. So, you know, what I wanted to do to start this panel a little bit was maybe just to follow up. You know, we had that question about taxation, and, you know, that could be a touchy question, but I think actually really important. And this whole question of the aviation sector and this discussion we're having here, and how does it connect up with the COP negotiations. And I think it's really important, the panel that we're going to talk about, the big picture on decarbonization, really linking that up. You know, it's easy to score some cheap political points, frankly, to come to this when there's a question about raising funding to point to the aviation industry. That's always easy. That happened about a decade ago with the Green Climate Fund. It wasn't really productive. But the real hard part is actually focusing on the aviation sector and working to reduce emissions from the sector. And I think the point's been made here earlier about the important role that aviation has in growing the economy around the world, in emerging economies and developing countries, and actually connecting those countries and helping them develop. And so that's critical, while at the same time focusing on decarbonization. So I think really the message here that's totally connected to the COP28 is what the aviation sector is doing to address decarbonization. And it's not about sort of an easy political point of putting a new tax on, but actually what we're doing and the hard work we're doing to reduce emissions from this really important sector. So that was one. I wanted to start with that. And then two, I think, you know, what was nice about the presentation from Virgin was that chart that showed all of the pieces that go into it, right? It's not just about SAF, it's not just about more efficient operations, but airlines are looking at kind of the whole system on how we make it more efficient. So I think that's how we're going to kick this panel off, and I'm going to first turn to Rob Miller to kick us off and talk a little bit about the work that he's doing at the University of Cambridge and the Whittle Lab, thinking about whole systems and how we can tackle decarbonization with that approach. So Rob, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. So at Cambridge, we're leading a sort of international group of over 100 experts called the Aviation Impact Accelerator. Includes universities like MIT, Melbourne, Rolls, Boeing, lots of companies involved. And we're trying to develop tools which will assist people in accelerating change. The complexity of the whole system we've talked about, from the resources through the production of fuels to the actual passenger journey, and then the climate impact, and the way sectors interact with neighbouring sectors are of first order importance when you're making these decisions. And actually in March, we were MIT and Cambridge held a joint workshop over in Boston where we got policymakers together from the US, UK and Europe, and we used the tool, a bit like a minority report, to explore live the potential solutions. And there were some exciting solutions that came from that, and I'm just going to tell you a little bit about those today. We took those back to Cambridge, and King Charles was really interested, and he has a real belief in the aviation sector, and he chose to make it the first event post-coronation to come to the Whittle Lab to bring together industry around those goals. Before I just briefly tell you those 4 goals we've come up with, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the nature of the model, because you'll see a lot of pathways and roadmaps are very smooth between now and 2050. And that's not how technology transitions go. And when you start to play with the model, as it gets more complex and realistic, you see tipping points within the model. You see bifurcations. You see particular actions that you can take at early dates that change your trajectory into the future. And so what we're doing in the model, these 4 goals, they're not trajectories all the way out to 2050. They are 4 actions that you can take up to before 2030 to change the future trajectory through the model. So I'll just briefly tell you what they are. So the first goal is to ensure that SAFs are delivered in a truly sustainable way. We've seen today it's very important we rapidly scale up SAFs. But what you find in the model is if you haven't got enough green hydrogen in the 2040s and you start stealing it off other sectors, the consequence on those sectors you have to bookkeep. And there are many sort of similar interactions through this process. So it's important by 2030 we have global policy in place that drives the right SAF transition in terms of its overall climate and nature solutions. The second goal is to drive a new business model in aviation. So aviation's been doing really well, as you've heard. 1 to 1.5% reduction in fuel burn per passenger kilometre per year. But that, to keep it going and to accelerate it, you can see at a whole systems level, by changing demand, operations, fleet renewal, you can accelerate that effect. And the model shows that if you can put the right incentives in place to change the business model of aviation by 2030, that this will drive demand and fleet management and operations, and you can get a 40% reduction in fuel burn by 2040. So the amount of fuel we could drive faster down that curve. So the third goal is to accelerate the demonstration of key technologies and infrastructure required to develop long-haul hydrogen aircraft. There's a real misconception in hydrogen. If you put the hydrogen, it's very light, but you put it together with the weight of the tanks that hold it at -253 C, and the weight is still about half that of jet fuel. So its advantage gets bigger with range. But we need to demonstrate those technologies, and to do that, we need to set up moonshot-style programs which would demonstrate several of these technologies and infrastructure by 2030. If you do that, you can really bring forward hydrogen, but you have to make that decision by 2030. And then finally, the goal would be to remove the cloud formed by aviation. So we know that 1 in 30 flights is producing a contrail. That's trapping heat in, warming the planet. The size of that 1 in 30 aircraft effect in warming the planet, we think, is the same as the other 30 aircraft's CO2 over 100 years. That's a huge effect. Now, the uncertainty on that's large, but the goal would be to trial and then deploy a contrail mitigation system that could start operating by 2030. So if I'm leaving you with one thing, it's think at a systems level. There are these bifurcations and tipping points that we must target early if we're going to tip the program. Don't think this is a smooth transition. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. And I think that ties back into some points that Annie Petzonk made this morning. And also, what you're doing is really fascinating because it doesn't shy away from the complexity, right? But also needs to do so in a way that is digestible and understandable so that we can actually make choices to decarbonize the aviation sector. So really, thank you for that. I'm going to turn to Conrad next. And I think, from an aviation sector perspective, one of the things that I think, and hopefully you'll kind of help us understand this, that the climate goals and decarbonization have become sort of integral to the success of the aviation sector. And as IATA, representing around 300 airlines around the world, we'd be interested in your perspective on that, Conrad.
Yeah, thanks very much, Kevin. And Rob, what a fantastic future, and we are part of the Accelerator project as well. And we totally support this kind of work because it's the sort of innovation that we need to drive the industry forward. We're committed, of course, and we were one of the first industries to commit to net zero by 2050, and we remain very much committed to that. We've had our struggles through COVID. The last 3 years, we've had losses as an industry. I'm very pleased to say that as of 2023, we're back into profitability as an industry globally. Now, one of the challenges with CAF 3 was that there's a huge differential between different regions in the world. And I think one of the earlier speakers spoke about the difference between maybe the developed world and the developing world. And so one of the struggles that we had as a membership organization was to try to close the gap between our members from the developed world and the members from the developing world. One of the things that is very clear to all of us is the essential part that SAF has to play in delivering that 2050 target, and particularly moving towards advanced SAF, as you saw from one of the earlier presentations. And so we're totally committed to driving SAF through as fast as we possibly can. One of the challenges for SAF, of course, is that it costs money, and then who is going to pay for that transition? And I think it's incumbent on all of us to work together to try to make that transition as fast and as smooth as possible, and to find all of the innovations that we can to make that innovation happen as fast as possible. One of the techniques that we would really buy into in a big way are national state roadmaps. We've heard about roadmaps from the UAE that sound extremely encouraging. We've had a lot of other roadmaps in Europe, in America, of course. We've got roadmaps work by Airbus and by MIT in Latin America. Roadmaps are tremendously important because they enable a government to look at the whole of the industry and also talk about other areas of activity, economic activity for a state, and then decide what the priorities should be, and then implement those things. So for SAF, we think it's very important now to get into implementation. We've got CORSIA, which kicks off from January of 2024, and we need to start putting in place national carbon credits to facilitate that transition. We also think that SAF accounting, we were very pleased to see that included into the CAF3 declaration, because it's very important to have a trusted SAF accounting engine and framework to be able to make this happen. So SAF's very important, but as Rob said, hydrogen, carbon capture, electrification are also extremely important. And as an industry, we're committed to being part of these simulations, part of these accelerators to make this transition even faster than 2050. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. One of the things that I think is really nice about the panel we have, to close out today is the different perspectives we're bringing. And again, I go back to the opening remarks. It's interesting how our opening panelists today pulled on some of the themes. So for the next question, I'm going to turn to Rob Johnston from the International Transport Workers Federation. And so, we're really eager to hear kind of your perspective, thinking from kind of the workers and a just transition. And ITF is an advocate for sustainable transportation and decarbonization, but importantly doing so through a worker-led just transition. So really hoping that you can tell us more about what that means from your organization's perspective and how that plays an important part in the aviation sector's goals.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, there's a lot to say in a very short space of time, but I'd also like to thank Haldane for the engagement we've had in ICAO and for today's event as well. I think the first thing to say is, from our perspective, there are a number of shared desires that we have. First of all, we understand that we need an industry which is profitable, investable, and sustainable, and we're on the same page with that. In order to achieve those three goals, we also believe that we need to do the following things. One, there needs to be multi-dimensional policies developed which actually bring the confidence into the industry to enable those things. And then, as you mentioned, linked to that is also the question around worker and just transition. We've heard a lot today about the different types of technologies that are coming on stream. We've heard also about the different possibilities. But of course, in all of those discussions, there's always the human element and the skills and the people that work in the industry in the future and their ability to adapt to the new skills that are needed in order to be able to retrain and in order to be able to attract new talents into the industry as well, and also to tackle pre-existing inequalities that have been in the industry previously and where progress has been made. So all of those are also very important elements for us to consider. And we believe that workers, of course, will play a key role into that transition. Most of our members, our unions and workers which are in the industry are fiercely proud to work in this industry, and many of them have worked in the industry for a long time. We'd like to see more young people in the industry, and we have to make the case that this is an industry that has a bright future and part of this process. I think one of the concerns around the just transition question, and also for the industry, the competitiveness and fragmentation in aviation to some degree has held it back a little bit from the conversations that we're having in maritime and elsewhere. And I think one of the real challenges for us as well, particularly when we're talking to governments and listening to a lot of the ministries that are here around, you know, many of them are focused on the short-term challenge, which normally coincides with an electoral cycle around charging points in cities and that type of thing, because it's a quick fix for them to be able to address that. It's easily explainable. Aviation is much more complicated. You have to take a much more longer-term view, and we really need to get the attention and go and be able to get the focus we need to provide that confidence, not just for the future workforce, not just for the investment in skills and that just transition. So those conversations which map out, transformation mapping, what do we have today, what do we have tomorrow? And, you know, if you look at a licensed engineer today, we maybe will need 5 different types of licensed engineer in the future to deal with each different type of fuel. So that type of collaboration and coordination will only come when we understand the full picture and we have the confidence to move forward. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. Such a critical perspective here. Next, we're going to bring in another airport perspective, and I'm going to ask Veronica Pamio from Aeroporto di Roma to talk a bit about what you're doing there at the airport, but also, I think importantly, the work you're doing within Italy with the recent sort of pact for decarbonisation for the transport sector. Really interested in your perspective and what you can share with us.
Okay, thanks. Thank you for being here, and thanks, Kevin. First of all, I'll skip all that's already been said about the airports and how can they decarbonize, and we've seen by ACI Europe this new initiative which is called ACA5. So I'll skip directly to what we're doing to engage together with the oil industry. We had this intuition some 2 years ago when we saw for example, the Inflation Reduction Act in the US and the subsidies that were requested in the EU, that the oil industry should work together in order to ensure that any policy defined at EU level or at Italian level should be science-based and really achievable. So that's what we did. We thought we could try to do, and put together the oil industry. We tried, we succeeded in it. So we had all industrial partners, aviation, of course, companies, airports, association, and NGOs, institution working together in this alliance, which is an Italian alliance of the oil sector. I said extended to other industrial partners, so energy producers and providers, in order to define what we can propose to stakeholders. So it's really an advocacy initiative, Italian-wise, and we're trying to do our best to put all these companies and organizations, which could also be in competition one to another, together in a place where we can define at least top-level policy to be proposed. And so we started in 2022. It's almost 2 years, but we've already had 2 annual congresses in Italy, a presentation at EU level to the Parliament and to the Commission, and yesterday we presented this initiative here at COP. And I can say that we decided to organize ourselves in 3 working groups that meet constantly throughout the year. One is on airports, so how airports can work together with the oil industry towards the 2030 and 2050 targets. Another one on airplanes, and of course it's about technology, so SAF, e-fuels, hydrogen, electric. And we know that over there we struggle a lot to find an overall position that can be approved by all of us. But for sure we know that we have to work on short-term and then medium and long-term target that we can agree on. And a third one, which is on intermodality, which is key, of course, for decarbonization, at least on the airport side, and also looking at the air-air multimodality, and we're also working on advanced air mobility. And a fourth one, which has just been created, it's on energy. So this is something that has been, let's say, copied in other member states in Europe, and we're happy about it because as long as we work all together, we are sure that we can find solutions to be presented that then stakeholders will define, mainly at EU level, because I understand that what has been US have been doing with subsidies. It's much easier to work on, while all the targets that we get from the EU have to be accepted by the entire sector, and they have to be achievable. Otherwise, we will not get to our targets. No.
Yeah, thank you very much. So next, I'm going to turn to Dan Rutherford. Dan, you've researched climate and the climate and environmental impact of aviation for many years now. What do you see as the biggest areas of opportunity in the years ahead, both in terms of impact and the ability to get it done?
Thanks, Kevin, and thanks to Haldane as well for inviting me here today. So by word of introduction, I direct the aviation and maritime shipping programs at the International Council on Clean Transportation. So if you caught it there, I have the honor of working on not one, but two of the hard-to-abate sectors that you also often hear reference to. But we definitely are keeping busy these days. There's a lot of exciting developments in the field, really more than I can easily track myself. Regarding the biggest opportunities ahead, a number of times today we saw a slide showing the various technology roadmaps to get to net zero aviation by mid-century. If you look carefully, there was a bar from the ICCT. It was our breakthrough scenario. If you look at those roadmaps collectively, there's pretty consistent messaging that, first of all, that getting to net zero aviation by 2050 is possible. That's point one. Point two, that clean fuels will play a central role in making that goal. And then finally, three, that significant policy intervention will be needed. To talk a little bit about the clean fuels part of the puzzle, I couldn't agree with you more, Rob. I think we do really need to recognize both that sustainable aviation fuels will be central to solving this problem, but that we have to be very deliberate about the integrity of those fuels. We should not put ourselves in a position where we are prioritizing quantity over quality of the SAFs. And I think you all know the reason why. I mean, SAF is an umbrella term that hides a lot of diversity in terms of feedstocks. And it's quite possible to have SAFs with near zero emissions. Conversely, it's also quite possible to create a sustainable aviation fuel that has life cycle carbon intensity comparable to or worse than conventional jet fuel. And so we really need to have a way to make sure that we distinguish between those types of fuels. And maybe calling back to Conrad's point a second ago, and also a point that Jane Hupe made this morning, I mean, there is a robust international framework for life cycle assessment of fuels. And we do think it's very valuable and important to stick to that agreement and not go out of our way to create new life cycle assessment methodologies at the country level that favor one particular fuel over others. Beyond that, I am particularly excited about a couple of recent developments. First of all, the push for greater transparency in emissions data from the aviation sector, and then also a move towards the adoption of interim targets for the sector. So there's a great volume of research that shows that there actually, even today, are material differences in the carbon intensity across carriers and across flights. So to give you one example, according to analysis that we released about 4 years ago, if you look at US routes, there's significant diversity in the carbon intensity of flights, such that a traveler domestically within the US could reduce the carbon per trip attributed to them by somewhere between 22 and 63%, just by choosing a less emitting flight. And so we're really heartened to see the development of more and more tools to provide that information directly to consumers so that they can reward airlines that make early investments in low-carbon technologies. Put in a plug, I am leading ICCT's partnership with Google to help refine their travel impact model. And that's being used now across Google Flights and a few other booking platforms to provide that emissions estimate in a transparent, comprehensive, and validated way. I'll put in the plug. We are doing 2 events later on today in the Green Zone, one at 4:15 and one at 5:15 in the Innovation Hub and the Climate Finance Hub, if you'd like to learn more about that. I'm also quite bullish on the adoption of interim targets because if you sort of think about this like as Goldilocks, a short-term target like a carbon neutral goal from 2020 tends to favor offsetting, which Lauren made the point earlier that offsetting, it has certain merits, but it's fundamentally divorced from the challenge of actually decarbonizing aviation itself. Conversely, if we go too far out, if we only have a 2050 target, we're lacking sort of the interim milestones to make sure that we actually are developing the technologies we need to get there. So I'm quite happy to start to see some interim targets coming in. I mentioned that I do cover shipping. ICAO went first and agreed to a net zero 2050 goal last year. Recently, the International Maritime Organization also adopted a net zero goal, but to that added pretty aggressive 2030 and 2040 indicative checkpoints. And I think that's an example of, coming from the shipping sector, that the aviation sector should also start to think about. Finally, ICCT has been involved in developing the well below 2 degree and 1.5 degree pathways under the Science Based Targets Initiative. So if you're familiar with those, that provides a framework for airlines to make midterm, so 2035 carbon intensity reduction goals. And that's been a really interesting learning experience for us. So we now have, I think, about 10 airlines that have signed up to the well below 2 degree pathway. Unfortunately, we do not yet have an airline that has formally adopted the 1.5 degree pathway. It's sort of thinking through why that is. It's inevitable reality. 1.5 is going to be more challenging than well below 2 degrees. But my personal conclusion actually is that a 1.5 degree pathway is going to be much more viable if we do start to credit non-CO2 reductions. So specifically, find a way to reward airlines that are abating contrails. And this goes back to your 4th point, Rob, earlier. So I think you may have heard the news. There was a study announced by Breakthrough Energy, Google, and American Airlines, where they did a pilot project and concluded that it's possible through rerouting of aircraft to cut contrail impacts by half with a very small fuel burn penalty. So I think what I'd like to see is more thought about how to integrate contrail abatement in particular into these reduction targets. So in summary, yes, getting high integrity SAFs, increasing transparency of emissions, getting more interim targets in place, and then having really a close look at contrail abatement, I think, are the most promising opportunities.
Thanks, Dan. I was thinking you'd make a good guest on a late night show because you've got everything in there, including some cross-marketing for your events this afternoon. Well done. But, you know, I think just to pull on 2 threads, the SAF credibility piece is so important, right? The credibility in accounting, that's what's going to make SAF work. I think everybody agrees, but we still need to get that right. And one of the challenges he referred to ICAO's life cycle methodology, and that's a really important point you make. It's also a real challenge, as we know, some of the areas like indirect land use and others have evolving research, right? And so how do you, we're not going to have a harmonized global harmony is a tough thing, but we aim for that, right? So we have as much harmony as possible while also realizing that the best practices and research are going to evolve. So it's easy to say, it's hard to do, and it's something that we're really focused on. And then your other point, that's a whole other topic that's really important, is this sort of transparency, data, and information. And it's a really, in my perspective, is sort of another another lever for addressing the sector's decarbonization objectives that we really are starting to tap into but need to do a lot more of. So that's great work. Last but not least, we're going to turn to Faustine de la Salle from the Mission Possible Partnership, and they've done work across hard-to-abate sectors on decarbonization roadmaps. So, really interested to hear your perspective, because you're thinking, you don't only focus on aviation, you actually focus on a lot of topics, so you may be able to think about ways in which aviation's unique or alike, and we're just eager to hear your perspective.
Yes, I have the pleasure to work not only on one, not on two, but on 7 heavy emitting industry and transport sectors at the same time. And it's always fascinating to join the conversations in the aviation sector, given the momentum that we see in this space. What we've been focusing on very heavily over the last 12 months is how do we get steel in the ground for projects, for assets, and in the aviation sector specifically for sustainable aviation fuel plants. One of the difficulties we're having, everyone who has spoken on the stage, I think today, has spoken about the need to scale sustainable aviation fuels, recognizing that there are multiple pathways with different carbon intensity attached to it and different challenges per pathways. The real difficulty is that I think we've seen a first wave of investment in sustainable aviation fuels that have benefited from a whole range of first mover advantages. And it's tremendous because it has enabled progress in terms of technology, but it has benefited from great level of policy support at national level, has benefited from premium demand from a number of airlines that really wanted to show the way. It has benefited obviously, as well, from the willingness of a number of energy players to start investing in that space and developing their knowledge base and their IP in that space. But those force movers conditions are, I think, drying out, unfortunately. We have, I think, a bigger challenge for that next wave of investment that we need before 2030 in a much bigger number of plants than what we have up and running today. And so the way we've been thinking about it in aviation and in other sectors, and I'll draw some comparisons, is what are the different levers we can play with to see investment flowing, even if the product is still more expensive than the grey alternative. And we know in aviation that the sustainable aviation fuels will remain for the foreseeable future more expensive than conventional jet fuel. Even though the cost can come down. So the idea is to really get to a scale where we can start seeing costs come down. And I think one of the advantages of aviation in that context is blending. This is not an opportunity that you see easily in the steel or in the cement sector. It's either you're green or either you're not, but you have to face the full cost immediately in your product. Whereas through blending, I think there's a more progressive path for aviation where you can use blending plus energy efficiency that was mentioned earlier as a way to mitigate your cost and progressively augment the quantity of sustainable aviation fuels as costs come down. So I think that's a real opportunity for aviation that doesn't quite exist even in the maritime sector, because in the maritime sector you have to have a different engine to use sustainable maritime fuels. You can't blend into the same engine or it's much more difficult. The other thing that I think is important is access to clean energy feedstock. And we've spoken about that earlier today. The struggle with the bio-based feedstock is really their availability and the fact that there is a high competition for access to those bio-based feedstock. Whereas for power to liquid, which is obviously less technologically advanced and therefore more costly today, there is a perspective of cost reduction, because in the end, for power to liquid and for hydrogen, you're relying on renewable electricity with costs coming down, hydrogen with costs coming down. So you'll benefit as a sector from the technology progresses that are achieved thanks to other hydrogen off-taking sectors that can then benefit technologies that will benefit the sustainable aviation fuel sectors. And the final point I wanted to make was on the demand side. I think a lot of the progress has been made in this sector thanks to voluntary demand, which is tremendous. But I have a big question mark on my mind on how far we can push that voluntary demand, especially for advanced fuels that come with a higher premium. And what we've seen tracking progress, and I'm sure many of you have noticed that over the past few years, is that the intervention of the blending mandate in Europe has really been a trigger point for investment in the sustainable aviation fuel value chain. So we shouldn't lose track of the power of regulation in this space to create that demand pool. And that's where the recent ICAO announcements are also very encouraging, because they point the way towards regulation on the biggest scale.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Well, we are sort of right at 2 o'clock, and we're going to take a little bit more time with this panel, but I'm also mindful of all of you who have sort of like stuck it out with us in this session and probably have other things on your agenda, so we won't go too long. But you know, I think it was great to hear the different perspectives, and again, like, we could have a long conversation with this group. I'm gonna spring a question on everyone that they're not prepared for. So I'm gonna filibuster a little bit as I stated. But we talked about interim targets in 2030, and I think each of you hit on this a little bit. But thinking about the recent ICAO target at CAF 3, which was a really important signal, but given the short duration between now and 2030, is going to be really challenging to achieve globally. If anybody thinks that a 5% emissions intensity reduction from aviation fuels by 2030 is not ambitious or not easy or is just going to happen, they're just wrong if they look at the facts on the ground. On the other hand, we know we need to do that and more. So it's sort of that tension of how do you be ambitious, but when you get to 2030, you're focusing on what you can do in the coming years. So the question is really about what you're thinking about in terms of the 1 or 2 things. If you look to 2030, what do we need to do? What when you're in 2030, would you say would be really kind of significant achievements by the sector, if there are things that we can actually accomplish between now and then? And so I won't just go down the line. I'll let the first person who's interested. Oh, Dan raised his hand first, and then Rob. Not a surprise to me that both of you raised your hands first.
True to form. Thank you for the question, Kevin. I mean, I would continue to sort of focus on the need for sort of binding interim targets, the value of transparency, certainly short-lived climate pollutants as an abatement mechanism. But I mean, completely agree with you that, you know, a global 2030 goal for 5% reduction in the carbon intensity of fuels, that's tough. I mean, that is tough. But we do very clearly have a mechanism by which to achieve it. There's already basically a mandate that would meet this goal. It's called Refuel EU. I think you're all probably quite familiar with it. It requires a 6% volumetric target for airlines flying out of Europe, all departing flights. So this would include international flights. If you kind of do the math, and we often hear that the ballpark figure that SAFs can provide up to an 80% reduction in life cycle emissions. So you multiply a 6% volume mandate by an 80% reduction, and you've got a 5% fuel carbon reduction. So I think the quick and simple answer is, if we are all behind a 5% reduction in carbon intensity at a global level, we should be thinking very seriously about having regional SAF mandates applying to all departing flights. That's based upon, well, very similar to the structure of the Refuel EU mandate.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. So I think you're exactly right. I mean, the 2030 5% reduction, it's an amazing thing that's done at CAF 3, and we need to push for that. But you're also right, we need to push for other things to do by 2030 to unlock the future. And I think the thing I'd say is, in a disrupted sector with high rates of technology change, we mustn't get trapped in the present. Those experiments we do by 2030 will unlock new futures, and that's what the sort of modelling shows. And so we've got to be experimenting at the edge of the bell curve. And the 2 areas I would experiment in is I'd experiment in contrails. Switching off contrails or contrail mitigation, getting a global system up and running by 2030, I think is very important. It's up to half the effect. The uncertainties are large, but it is a big benefit. And I would experiment on advanced hydrogen engines. They offer potential for a 20% energy per passenger kilometre reduction below conventional aircraft, and that would be a huge unlock. And finally, to plug, at 4 o'clock today, in the climate finance zone, we're going to demonstrate the tool with the 4 unlocks if you want to come. So please come along. Sorry, Dan.
Nicely done. Now, next I'm going to go to Veronica.
Yeah. We've discussed a lot about what the sector has to do, but I think that if we want to be sure that by 2030 we're going to achieve the targets, every company, every organization should think about its own targets and as soon as possible get it certified. So this is something that we did. Our group, Mundis, has had its target approved by Science Based Target Initiative, and this is something that obliges all the companies within the group, including, of course, our company, our airport in Rome, to take clear targets not only on scope 1 and 2, but also on scope 3, meaning landing and takeoff, for example. If every company starts doing this and starts having its target approved by science-based or whatever other science-based initiatives exist, this means that everyone will do its own part trying to achieve this target. So that's what popped up.
Thank you so much. Conrad, you've got the mic.
Thanks very much, Kevin. So I alluded to this earlier. I mean, there's a huge regional imbalance in the terms of supply and production of SAF. So if you talked about Europe and North America, where the vast majority of the production will be in 2030, no problem. You'll do much better than 5%, far better than 5%. But the issue is that in most parts of the world, there is no construction whatsoever. So here we are in 23, almost 2024. If we say that it takes 5 to 7 years to build a SAF production plant, it's totally unrealistic to expect certain parts of the world to be able to hit a 5% target. So I think that's really the sort of the stumbling block in terms of that one. And I think on the part of the industry, we're committed to 2050. And I think that your point, Dan, about having further interim targets is a good one as well. It's one of the things we actually spoke to ICAO about, but it was too difficult at the time to actually negotiate within the time frame for CAF 3. But certainly there needs to be more spacing so that we can see and map out a path towards 2050 in a way that really works. So I think those would be the most important things. And just on Faustine's point, in terms of blending, this is a really good idea. And one of the issues with the really sort of highly advanced approaches is that the cost is very high. So if we can find a way to reduce that cost and sort of build a gentler slope, that would be very good. Finally, I loved Aeroporto di Roma's Italy thing yesterday, and we had the Italian government saying we want to be pragmatic, we want to be affordable. And what they were really talking about was that our industry is fantastic. It connects the world. We don't want to price it at such a level that we disconnect the world. So that means that we need to find a way to get, whether it's blending, whether it's new technologies, to be able to make it, to continue to have it as affordable. Sure, it's going to be more expensive, but let's not price it to a point where actually people can't afford to travel anymore. As an industry, we've done an astonishing job in terms of making aviation affordable to pretty well everybody. Let's not destroy that, and let's build our way towards a sustainable future, but do it in a way that works and continues to draw the benefits of aviation in terms of the overall economy.
Thanks. Faustine.
I'll be tougher, because if we want to have achieved our targets by 2030, we actually need final investment decisions by 2026, 2027. So I think that's the timeline we're looking at if we're serious. And we need several hundred sustainable aviation fuel plants to have been sanctioned at FID level by 2026, 2027 at the latest. We're not that far in terms of publicly announced projects. So what's required now is collaboration across the industry, and I think one of the strengths of the industry is the really deep collaboration already existing across the different players in the value chain to ensure that all of those plans that have been announced actually appear and materialize.
Thank you. And Rob Johnston, we're going to give the last word to you.
Thank you very much. I was just going to echo some of the words of Conrad. There is very much a a regional dimension to this as well. So it's not like for like. And I think the last thing I would say is, there is a narrative which says the industry is reluctant to change or needs to be forced to change, but we've seen today that is not the case at all. But we're also realistic and pragmatic and know that we have to change within the framework. So to set some arbitrary targets which aren't listening to the industry, aren't listening to the pace of the change, and don't provide the ingredients to allow that change to happen, it's just not realistic. So I think it's better to allow the industry to do what it needs to do, to listen, to keep the dialogue open, and then work on the infrastructure which is needed there to allow the change to happen within the period that we've already designated. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. And thank you to our panelists. Round of applause.